Hi, and welcome to Amicus. This is Slate's podcast about the courts and the law and the Supreme Court, and I'm Dahlia Lithwick. I cover those things for Slate, and I'm about to be joined by senior writer Mark Joseph Stern, my ride or die person through all things Opinionpalooza. We're going to bring you this emergency edition of Amicus in the wake of a big and unbelievably surprising decision that came down from the court Thursday morning to not further eviscerate what's left of the Voting Rights Act. These extra episodes would usually be reserved for Slate Plus subscribers only, but we've lifted the paywall for a limited time to make sure absolutely everybody has a chance to keep up with this really monumentally important term and the barrage of decisions coming down in the coming weeks from the High Court. But we do rely on your support to do all this, so please consider becoming a subscriber to Slate Plus to support our mission of creating a new kind of Supreme Court coverage by going to slate.com/Amicus Plus. And Plus members, we love you. Your next exclusive segment drops Saturday with Mark Stern and I answering some of your really smart listener questions. Just one other note, like everyone else on the Eastern Seaboard, I am having smoke issues. I'm a wicked asthma sufferer, so don't be alarmed by the way my voice sounds in the upcoming few minutes. Along with Mark Joseph Stern, my nebulizer is my ride or die best friend. So the word I want to use to describe Thursday morning's voting rights decision is just jaw-dropping. In what was surely one of the most important cases of this whole term, Allen v. Milligan, this was a challenge to a 2020 redistricting effort by the state of Alabama. They sought to draw maps that would have created just one congressional district in which Black voters made up a majority, despite the fact that Black voters represent about 27% of the voting population in that state. Alabama legislators fought to hold on to that map, despite a challenge that was brought by multiple voting rights and racial justice coalitions, arguing that the maps violate Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. That was once the crown jewel of voting rights legislation, but it's been hollowed out into a fragile shell of its former self by a series of decisions from the John Roberts Court. That's what makes it all the more striking that the majority opinion upholding this three-judge panel's decision in January of 2022 to strike down the new Alabama map, finding that it illegally diluted the votes of Black Alabamians. Gobsmacking, because guess who wrote the opinion? John Roberts, the guy who's been beavering away to erode the VRA since the start of his career, and yet writes in this opinion like he's channeling Elena Kagan's dissent in that Brnovich decision, the one that made Section 2 challenges all but impossible, only 2 terms ago. Roberts joined Justice Alito's majority opinion in Brnovich, and perhaps even more surprising, the 3 liberals and the Chief Justice were joined in this reaffirmation of the beating heart of Section 2 by one, Brett Kavanaugh, who just a few short months ago had voted with the conservative bloc to allow that Alabama map to go into effect for the midterms. So what happened? Mark Joseph Stern is here to help us make sense of some of this, I think. Mark, can you start by laying out the facts? This was a set of maps drawn by a red state legislature after the 2020 census to create this crazy snaking district that packed all the Black voters, almost 30% of the population, into one district and then spreading out the rest of them in districts where their votes could not prevail. This is kind of classic cracking and packing, as it's known. And a 3-judge panel says, yeah, after extensive findings, we agree this violates the VRA, right?
Let me just pick up my jaw off the floor. This is, as you say, a really shocking decision. I did not expect it. I don't think anyone expected it. John Roberts, as you noted, has been an avowed foe of the Voting Rights Act for his entire career. In the 1980s, he was at the Justice Department lobbying against the effort in Congress to pass a new amendment to the Voting Rights Act that would prohibit any kind of voting law, including a congressional map, that has a racially discriminatory impact, not just a discriminatory intent. And that's really important. That's sort of at the heart of this case, right? Because when the VRA was first passed, it was all about intent, proving that, these Jim Crow legislators were trying to keep Black people out of the political process. But that doesn't account for maps like Alabama's in this case, where it's pretty clear that white Republicans were trying to lock Black Americans out of the political process, but there was no smoking gun to prove that they did it because they were racist. And so here we have John Roberts in 2023 sounding like a freaking social justice warrior. I mean, really sounding like a Voting Rights Act aficionado, saying this was absolutely designed to prohibit a discriminatory impact on Black voters. He traces the whole history through Congress and through the Justice Department in the 80s, where he was lobbying against this change to the Voting Rights Act, and says, but Congress did what it did. We have this law before us, and we are obligated to apply it as written. And in this particular case, it is so painfully clear that the map in question just packs as many Black voters into one district as it can, and then cracks or disperses the remaining voters in majority white districts, and prevents Black people in the state from having as much political power, or anywhere close to as much political power, as they should by right. That is not a decision I ever thought John Roberts would write. I actually think that there's kind of an Easter egg in it for real Roberts fans among us, because he quotes an op-ed written by the Attorney General in the 1980s opposing the Voting Rights Act amendment that included this discriminatory impact test. I'm like 99% sure that John Roberts ghost wrote that op-ed. So we literally have Roberts quoting his own ghost writing in the past against the VRA in a decision that upholds and affirms the VRA, not only in this case, but more broadly affirming its constitutional legitimacy and Congress's legitimate authority to apply this kind of broad prophylactic racial justice law against state voting rights laws and suppression and measures and whatever. So it's a big deal. I'm a little bit frenzied because I never would have guessed this would be the outcome. But I think this is like really good news for multiracial democracy.
The one thing you're saying, Mark, that I think is so important is that if you're John Roberts and you are in year 2 of Legitimacy Gate, where the court is being accused over and over of being a sort of partisan political institution, there is nothing more powerful as a piece of performance art than saying, I was against this when I was lobbying. I was against this when I was in government. I am holding this out to you as a really, and he does, this was a really thorny question about this amendment and how to amend it and, what to do with the case law that came before. But Congress has decided and I shall abide. I mean, it's just such an amazingly performative way of saying, I am not the guy I was when I was lobbying against this. And here's how I'm going to show you. And then, as you say, he quotes in just lavish detail the reasons the VRA was necessary and the just deep ugliness of, Jim Crow vote suppression. So I guess it doesn't fully account for, the one beat in here, which is last February on the shadow docket, that illegitimate docket that Steve Laddick made up just to torture Samuel Alito. SCOTUS took the opportunity to pause this 3-judge panel decision, and Roberts voted with the liberals at the time, but as he noted, he just didn't like the way it was happening, right? In this unsigned opinion on the shadow docket, he certainly didn't intimate that he was opposed to, the bulk of the attacks on Section 2. I think we all thought the writing was on the wall after that vote, and we certainly thought the writing was on the wall after oral argument. So it does raise this question for me. Is this the Chief Justice making a kind of opportunistic decision to be law and order guy, rule of law guy, principled, stare decisis, deference, humility, umpire guy? Or has he changed his worldview on the Voting Rights Act?
No, I don't think he's changed his worldview. I think maybe he's mellowed out a little bit, I think he's been in this position long enough to see some of these extremely racist maps and understand that, it's not all just gratuitous Democratic complaints that are really sort of cynical efforts to get more Democratic seats in the House, that there is a real problem here. But I do think this is the same John Roberts who cast the vote in NFIB upholding most of the Affordable Care Act. This is the same John Roberts who cast the vote striking down the census citizenship question. Like, this is the John Roberts who makes periodic institutional statements from the court to say, we are not going to get bossed around or bullied by conservative lawyers in red states who think that we have a duty to them to just overturn whatever precedent they don't like, and that they have our votes in their pockets. And what's really, surprising is not just that, but that Brett Kavanaugh went along, right? Because Roberts could do that when he was the swing vote. Roberts could do that when Anthony Kennedy was siding with Scalia trying to destroy the whole ACA, and he got to step up and be like, I'm the captain now. But in this situation, he, I think, probably had to work really hard for Kavanaugh's vote because, going back to that February order that you mentioned, it was a 5-4 order in 2022. Brett Kavanaugh was the decisive vote, and the court blocked a new map that would have been much fairer and compliant with the Voting Rights Act and preserved the illegal map that the court has struck down today. And that Brett Kavanaugh wanted to preserve the map, and this Brett Kavanaugh strikes down the map. Like, how do you square those things? And if you asked him, I'm sure he'd say, well, back then it was too close to the election. We have to apply the Purcell principle. But that's BS, and we all know it. The election was still months and months and months away. I suspect what happened is behind the scenes, Roberts decided to seize upon this case as one of those moments where he values the court's institutional legitimacy more than his own preferences, which are very, very rare, quite fleeting, but they do happen, and was able to bring along Kavanaugh for the ride, perhaps because of legitimacy gate and ethics gate and all of the scandals that are swirling around the court, but also perhaps because, this is not Brett Kavanaugh's number one issue. I don't think that he hates the Voting Rights Act with the same deep loathing of someone like Neil Gorsuch or Clarence Thomas. He wants to present himself as someone who does care about racial justice. Look at his opinion in the racist jury case, right? He wants to hold himself out as somebody who sees racial injustice in America and acknowledges that the courts have a role to play in policing it. And also, he wants to stand side by side with the chief and say, we're doing this. Like, we are going to vote in a way that probably doesn't align with our policy preferences, might not align with our genuine legal views, but does sort of hold the court above the political branches, above the partisan fray, and give this victory to voting rights that nobody expected, that, yes, is going to serve as cover for a bunch of terrible decisions coming down the pipeline. We all know that. Let's not pretend. But will also have a meaningful role in preserving multiracial democracy and prevent everybody from just saying all the time, this court follows policy, this court's lawless, this court's illegitimate. Now, when that happens, people who defend the court are going to point to this case and say, hey, they upheld the VRA. What are you complaining about? And that is going to be a powerful rebuttal, given how important and pretty, sweeping in a way this decision turned out to be.
We're going to take a quick break. The Supreme Court was designed to be above the fray, but just now, are the 9 justices living up to that promise? On the new season of More Perfect, host Julia Longoria brings the highest court in the land down to earth. You will meet people on all sides of crucial cases as she shares history that explains how we got here. More Perfect from WNYC Studios. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey there, Amicus listeners. It's Mary Harris from over at Slate's Daily News podcast, What Next? What Next is a show we make to help you grapple with this question. How do you keep paying attention to the news when it feels like the news is stuck? You know what the Republicans are going to be saying. You know what the Democrats are going to be saying in return. You probably even think you know how you're going to feel about all of it. My short daily podcast is here to help you make sense of things, even surprise you, from fleshing out new angles to uncovering stories that have largely gone unreported. When the news feels a little predictable, I'm here to help you answer what next. So subscribe wherever you're listening right now.
If you are behind on your listening, you may have missed the news that Amicus is going to be going weekly throughout these next few weeks of the court session. This is all part of Slate's Opinionpalooza initiative, which sounds like a lot of fun, but is actually pretty serious and painstaking work. Please keep up with all the ways we're working toward a new way to cover the High Court by subscribing to the newsletter at slate.com/opinionpalooza/newsletter. You will stay up to date on the latest from the jurisprudence team, Slow Burn Season 8, Becoming Justice Thomas, and of course, all the latest from the Amicus podcast. And now back to my conversation with Mark Joseph Stern. I woke up thinking, we used to be able to say, one for you, one for me, right? That if the court was going to go big on something, they'd go small on two other things. And that has not been the vibe in the last 2 years. This feels very much like back to almost the Kennedy era, where somebody at the center of the court is making calculations about not, swinging for the fences in every single case. And so in some sense, it doesn't posit, a 3-3-3 court or anything like it, or moderates at the center, but it posits the idea that there are people at the center that are making calculations separate and apart from what their, as you say, their policy preferences would be, calculations about how much of a hit the court can take going into the last weeks in June. I would love for you to, and I think you make this point so well, both in your piece and just now. Robert seems to have a line beyond which he will not go. And we saw that in the Affordable Care Act cases. As you said, we saw it on the census, the citizenship census case, where he just does not want to carry like filthy water for people who have constructed a completely, coffee out your nose theory and then ask the court to do its bidding. And I think you write today that this very much feels like John Roberts, in some sense, just saying like, boop, on the nose of Alabama. You can do lots and lots of things, and I hate Section 2 as well, but please don't do it dirty. Is that the sense you get from his opinion? Because he sure writes with just dripping contempt for the way Alabama went about doing the thing it sought to do.
Yeah, and that, I think, was the message from liberal justices at oral arguments. I think Justice Kagan made this point she was just scathing during arguments, pinning down Alabama's lawyers, saying, you are so shameless in what you are doing. This is clearly just a cynical effort to take advantage of the votes you think you have on this court to gut precedent that stood for 40 years. And Alabama's lawyer did not have a good response to those questions, right? He really floundered during oral arguments. It was kind of painful to listen to. Although, of course, the arguments he was making were horrendous and racist, so not that painful. But I think the Chief Justice was listening. And that's one of the messages in this case, is he watched those exchanges and saw how Alabama's Solicitor General thought he just could walk up to that lectern and say whatever he wanted, because at the end of the day, there were going to be 5 or 6 votes in his corner. And that kind of calculus offends the Chief Justice. And, in the census case, and in some other cases, you and I have said the Chief Justice's philosophy is sort of lie better next time, right? There was the same thing in the Dreamers case involving DACA. The bad lawyering seemed to have been a decisive factor. I think there's a similar issue here where, Alabama tried to devise this whole alternative test for these kind of VRA claims where they would run millions of simulations in a computer and they wouldn't take race into account at all because it's unconstitutional to consider race. And they would just compare the simulations to the actual map and say, well, do they look roughly the same? Is the average simulation like the average map? And it's bogus. As I'm describing it, your eyes are probably rolling to the back of your head and then all the way back around. It's this idea that you can totally cut race out of VRA claims and still come up with a fair map. And what Robert says is that gets this entirely backward. We don't have to guess what Congress wanted to do here. Congress said states have to consider race. when they are drawing a map to comply with the Voting Rights Act. It can't predominate, but it can and sometimes must be a consideration to avoid the kind of maps that disproportionately dilute the votes of Black citizens. And like if Alabama had come up with a really kind of small ball incremental argument, maybe they would have had a chance, but they really swung for the fences here. They just laid it all out. You know, there was the whole multi-million simulation argument. There was overturn all of the existing tests argument. There was the entire Section 2 effects test is unconstitutional and you have to throw it out argument. And Roberts just goes down the line and really shows why each of them is so cynical and shameless and brazen. And again, I really think like that is the Roberts who voted to uphold the ACA. That is the Roberts who says, I cannot tolerate a certain level of dirty lawyering and I am not going to play along with this. Even if my heart and my brain want me to, this remains a bridge too far.
Yeah, it's almost as though he wishes that lawyer John Roberts, that he was for most of his career, brought these cases so that Justice John Roberts could greenlight them. But because they were brought by kind of Keystone Cops lawyers making very, very, as you say, fatuous, but also really poorly supported arguments, he's just like, damn, why can't I be on both sides of the lectern? Okay, go away. Come back next time. Clarence Thomas has a lot of feelings in a very lengthy dissent. Boy, does he have feelings. It's so crazy he couldn't make his disclosure deadline, but he does have time for feelings.
So many feelings. I mean, you know, Thomas has a bunch of beefs with the VRA. You know, first of all, he basically thinks racial discrimination is over in voting, like it doesn't happen anymore. That was back in the day, and so we don't need this. He says that Section 2 does not even apply to this particular kind of redistricting, that even though Congress came in and like amended the entire VRA specifically because of a redistricting case and specifically in light of racist redistricting, that it somehow does not apply to this kind of redistricting, which would just completely remove like meaningful judicial oversight from the redistricting process and make it incredibly easy for states to pass off racist maps. He goes through piece by piece and sort of explains why he thinks all of Roberts' analysis is wrong and why the Alabama lawyers got it right. There's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of like the real social justice means race blindness 100% of the time, kind of classic Clarence Thomas stuff. And there's a lot of like confusion about why the court is stepping in here when just a few years ago it said in Rucho that it couldn't deal with partisan gerrymandering. And this is like I think maybe the only sort of interesting part of Thomas's dissent to me, where he basically says like, we were supposed to get out of the whole redistricting mess, the whole briar patch, and here we are still doing it. What the hell happened? And I think Robert's answer is, look, race and partisanship are different. Like the Constitution protects against discrimination against race, and it does not protect discrimination on the basis of partisanship. And so we have a duty as affirmed by Congress to step in here. But again, like that's a very different Roberts from the guy who wrote Rucho and made it sound like redistricting was an impossible thing for courts to police. So to some degree, you can understand Thomas's frustration. He's like, I thought Johnny was on my side here, but clearly Roberts had a bigger agenda item to check off the list. And he just does not even spend much time responding to Thomas, just a couple of different footnotes with some sick burns, because what Thomas is doing is almost irrelevant to the project at hand.
Yeah, it's the sick burns that really surprised me. It does feel like it's another way in which we forget what a good writer John Roberts is until you see some of his footnotes in this case and you're like, ooh, ouch, it's going to be awkward at conference next week.
Can I just read you one where Thomas he says, well, okay, so Roberts drops this footnote where he says the principal dissent, which is Thomas, complains that what the district court did here is essentially no different from what many courts have done for decades under this court's superintendents. And Roberts adds, that is not such a bad definition of stare decisis, which I love. And there's another footnote where Roberts says that Thomas is quixotically jousting with an imaginary adversary, repurposing one of Thomas's own burns right back at him. I mean, that's the kind of stuff that people like me live for. So I just have to salute Roberts for making this job fun every once in a while.
Go beyond the headlines and deepen your understanding of the forces shaping our world today on The Political Scene, a newly updated podcast from The New Yorker. With episodes 3 times each week, the political scene accesses the sharpest minds on politics, offering insight and analysis about everything, from abortion rights to the war in Ukraine. Join me, Tyler Foggett, for conversations with the most knowledgeable minds from The New Yorker that will dive deep on the most interesting political story of the week. Then, Susan Glasser, Jane Mayer, and Evan Osnos gather to hash out what's happening in Washington, D.C., with an insider's understanding of the high stakes at this perilous moment for American democracy. Plus, our editor David Remnick will provide you with insightful storytelling with a mix of interviews and profiles. That's all happening on the political scene. Make sure you're following it now, wherever you get your podcasts.
Last question, Mark, before we say goodbye. Coming into this morning, I think we thought that voting rights advocates had nothing left. I mean, nothing left in their toolkit if Section 2 was either eviscerated or the test was so high that nobody could ever meet the burden. Voting rights advocates around the country today have at least some confidence that they have a toolkit with which to do their jobs. Has the law, in any sense, become better for them, or is it just that the catastrophe did not fall?
I would say that the law does become better after today because, look, the law for at least a year since that shadow docket order has basically been we're suspending the VRA's protections against racial vote dilution and racial gerrymandering. And that's what Roberts complained about, back in that February shadow docket order where he was like, I also hate the VRA, but we shouldn't be rewriting it on the shadow docket. It turns out, as of June 8th, the VRA lives, it survives. And so there were all of these cases over the last 2 years in places like Louisiana and Georgia and South Carolina, where there were very strong claims of racial vote dilution that federal courts had to sort of just set aside because the smoke signals coming from SCOTUS were, we aren't playing this game anymore. Red states can just go to town on Black communities. And here, we suddenly see in a big reveal, a twist ending, actually there are 5 justices who are willing to enforce and uphold the Voting Rights Act, and specifically the ban on maps that have a disproportionately negative impact on racial minorities. So this means that not only in Alabama, but also in Louisiana and potentially places like Georgia and South Carolina, there are going to be new maps. Courts are going to have to impose new maps, or legislatures will have to redraw them and add at least one majority Black seat, which will almost certainly translate into a Democratic seat. And that means that this decision, among other things, is really good news for Democrats in 2024, because this gives them at least a handful more probably safe seats in the House of Representatives. And given that the GOP majority is so tiny now, this decision is really a blow to the Republican odds of maintaining the House in 2024. And though I really want to separate out race and partisanship and not act as though this is all just a game for Democrats to try to up their tally of seats, that is an important outcome that Roberts and Kavanaugh knew about, that was top of mind for them, and they still decided to vote this way. And that is really important and worth noting.
Mark Stern, we are told by Mark Stern that the justices are just too lazy to get out of their soft pants. And so we're only going to hear more decisions next Thursday. Is that correct?
Yeah, because, they don't want to have to go all the way into work. Who goes into the office these days, Dahlia? Come on, it's 2023. They're just justices. What do they even have to do there?
We should stop calling it the Roberts Court and call it the Soft Pants Court. We will talk to you, I guess, on Saturday for a little extra gossip and wine and whining. But Mark, it's always a treat to have you.
Wine and whining. That is the Amicus motto, isn't it, Dahlia?
That and the soft pants, baby, every time. And that is a wrap for this episode of Amicus. Thank you so much for listening in, and thank you so much for your letters and your questions. You can always keep in touch at amicus@slate.com, or you can find us at facebook.com/Amicus Podcast. Today's show was produced by Sarah Birmingham, Alicia Montgomery, Vice President of Audio at Slate, and Ben Richmond is our Senior Director of Operations. We will be back with another episode of Amicus on Saturday, and until then, take good care.